Over the past few years, we've seen some truly impressive creations come out of the ROM hacking scene. Whether you wish to force-feed Sonic the Hedgehog onion rings till he can no longer move, experience Mega Man 2 through the eyes of the angry video game nerd, or simply remix a game that you've played a million times, there's surely more hacks out there than any sane person has the time for. To tell you the truth, I really don't have much interest in those types of hacks. Sure, they're novel, but in most cases, I get really bored very quick. On the flip side, I found myself more invested in hacks that have a more utilitarian purpose. You know, hacks that incorporated updated features, or optimized certain aspects to make a game more playable, or in some cases, more tolerable. Oftentimes, these sorts of hacks are pushed to the wayside because they aren't exactly flashy, controversial, or ridiculous. So, I thought it would be fun to shine a light on some of the more useful hacks that I've discovered, and I think they're well worth checking out. Game hacks are hugely popular these days. Sites like romhacking.net add content daily, but not all of it is what I consider good. In my quest to find hacks that skew closer to a game's original vision, I'm sure that I'll miss plenty of really good original efforts, but hopefully I'll be able to show you something that interests you. For all intents and purposes, the cartridge hacks featured in this episode should be playable on original hardware using a flash cart like an EverDrive, or via jailbroken firmware on the analog FPGA consoles. Cartridge-based game hacks are designed to be applied to ROMs using an IPS patcher, such as Lunar IPS. CD-based consoles will need to be modified so they can play burned backup discs, or with an optical drive emulator. Games on disk media are much bigger and more complex, so they're usually more difficult to deal with and use a variety of different patchers. I'm not going to be really getting into the nitty-gritty of applying these patches, so if you see something here that interests you, you might have to put in some additional legwork of your own to get them up and running. Granted, you might be able to find pre-hacked versions if you don't want to get into all that stuff, but it's up to you to find them. When a game makes the jump from one region to another, many times there's a laundry list of changes that comes along with it. But one of the coolest things about a ROM hack is that we're able to compile those changes, take notes, and build a perceived best version of the game, from graphics, to sound, to difficulty, and beyond. This was especially true when it came to Nintendo games, who were famous for removing imagery that they perceived as controversial in the West. Some of the more obvious examples of this are in the Castlevania games, where crosses and other religious iconography were tweaked or omitted completely. These kind of restoration hacks are pretty commonplace on the NES, with many of them existing solely to put these minor tweaks back in. Gargoyle's Quest II had a number of demonic references removed. But that's not to say that Nintendo was the only one to dole out this type of censorship. In Streets of Rage 2 on the Genesis, there were a few extremely minor graphical changes made to various animations and other details. Despite being barely noticeable, these alterations were reinstated in a decensored restoration. Color restorations are kind of an expansion on this overall idea. These hacks are all about tweaking a game's color usage to match closer to the source material. Many times this is completely inconsequential, but people might prefer them nonetheless. Ghostbusters on the Genesis has a hack that does nothing more than make the uniform colors tan instead of white in an effort to make it look closer to the source material. Revenge of Shinobi's restoration is equally insignificant, making the Spider-Man and Batman bosses the color of their comic book counterparts. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance on the Game Boy Advance has a hack that gets rid of the blue glow around Just Belmont. This originally served the purpose to make it easier to track him on a system without a lit screen, but it looks so much better without it. Many of the best color restorations have been done by a hacker named Gabriel Pyron, who has produced a number of very cool color hacks for the Genesis and Sega CD. One of my favorites is the Golden Axe color restoration, which has a less contrasty, more faded look to it. Although unfortunately, it doesn't make Gilius Thunderhead's axe gold like the arcade game. Of course, this is just a mere sampling of Pyron's work. A number of other standouts, like Final Fight CD, which has skin color, clothing, and background colors altered to look more natural and accurate to the coin-op original. While we're on the subject of graphical tweaks, PlayStation fans who have the ability to play backups of their games should check out the DDither patcher for games on the system. Dithering is the use of alternating patterns, such as lines or checkerboards, in an attempt to simulate more colors than a game or console is capable of displaying at one time, and is especially common on early 3D consoles. The method for hacking out dithering in PlayStation games was discovered by Chris Cobell. And Shmups.com forum user Crazy Manzer created an extremely easy-to-use brute force patcher for it. All you have to do is drop a PS1 disk image file into the .bat file, and it'll generate a patched version. Probably the biggest jump in quality comes from Castlevania Chronicles, which is a port of the X68000 reimagining of the first game. Normally, the PlayStation 1 absolutely butchers the artwork of the game by applying heavy dithering across everything. Removing the dithering makes a world of difference and almost makes it feel like a brand new game. Strider 2 selectively adds dithering from area to area. It's out of control in the Iceberg base section, especially in the background. Some games already have the dithering baked into the graphics, which can give the impression of looking virtually unchanged after being patched. However, the trade-off for removing dither is that the PlayStation will render shading as strong bands of color instead. As such, de-dithering is at its best when it's used on games that make heavy use of 2D elements. Final Fantasy Tactics' use of dithering is fine for the 3D portions, but the checkerboard pattern across all the characters is pretty ugly. Removing the dither here fixes that, and the 3D elements don't suffer at all. So your mileage may vary from game to game. You'll just have to try the patch and choose dithering or no dithering to see what you prefer. If you're curious to learn more about dithering and how it's used on the PlayStation 1, Displaced Gamers on YouTube has an excellent video on the subject that is well worth checking out. Fixing up or restoring audio is a whole other subgenre of ROM hack that doesn't get a lot of appreciation. Perhaps it's because it's really difficult to show the difference. You've really got to have an idea of what was wrong with the sound in the first place. Although we didn't get the FM Sound add-on module for the Master System here in North America, many games have the coding still on the cart if you have the hardware to be able to take advantage of it, such as the PowerBase Mini FM or a mod. There's a couple of notable instances where the code for the FM audio was removed: Phantasy Star and Wise. I mean, Ys, the Vanished Omens. I've talked at length about the former, but the FM sound restoration for Ys brings that soundtrack back into the fold. While I don't always love FM music renditions on the Master System, this is one of the few where I'd prefer to play with it on. There are a number of musical alterations in Zanac on the NES when it was brought to the US. The general consensus seems to be that the Japanese Famicom version is slightly better. A music restoration hack puts the Famicom music into the US version of the game. Back in 2014, a ROM hacker named Rain Warrior noticed some issues with the overworld and ending music in Star Tropics on the NES. Certain notes were glitched, throwing off the timing of different layers of the mix. Through a simple hack, we're now able to hear the music as it was originally composed. Music restoration hacks are especially prevalent on the Game Boy Advance, where ports of SNES games suffered badly. Since the Game Boy Advance doesn't have dedicated sound hardware, these restorations still have that signature fuzzy GBA sound and don't quite sound perfectly accurate to the originals. But I'd say that it's a nice improvement. Breath of Fire had a sound restoration that I felt was much nicer sounding than the original Game Boy Advance music. Breath of Fire 2 and several of the Final Fantasy ports received similar treatment, but it's hard to say if they truly sound better or not. Undub is the practice of reinstating the original Japanese voiceover into a game where the English dub just isn't cutting it. While I felt that it was more of an endearing quality and fit the atmosphere of the game, a lot of people absolutely despise the English dub in Grandia on the PlayStation 1. The Undub is for those people in particular, which restores the original Japanese voices both in and out of battle.
よーし、ガンツのやつ見てろよ。
私たちも行こう。うい。
見つけてきたぞ、ガンツ。最初の宝物。
Tri has spent a lot of time singing the praises of Ninja Ryukenden 3 on the Famicom, better known as Ninja Gaiden 3, the Ancient Ship of Doom, here in North America. As we know, the US version famously upped the difficulty, not only by adding more enemies and making Ryu's defenses paper thin, but also removing the infinite continue system that was a mainstay of the series, as well as the Japanese version's new password feature. It's speculated that changes such as this were implemented in an effort to combat the video game rental market, but it could also turn a great game into an exercise in frustration. The Ninja Gaiden 3 Restored hack revives the deleted passwords and continue system, and ups Ryu's defense to align with the Japanese version, all while keeping the enemy placement of the US version. So while it's not a complete restoration of the Japanese version's material, it's better to view it as more of an ultimate version of the American release. Contra Hard Corps on the Genesis was another game that saw a steep difficulty increase in localization. While the US version might be the toughest game in the series outside of Shattered Soldier, the Japanese version is a bit more lenient. Instead of the series staple of one-hit deaths, the Mega Drive version gives you 3 hit points per life, allowing some wiggle room before you lose your equipped weapon. The hit point restoration hack imports the system into the North American version of the game. Thankfully, this doesn't break the game, it just evens the odds for those struggling with the difficulty. While not as severe, even Contra 3 on the Super NES had some difficulty modifiers incorporated into the US version to make it tougher, although nothing was quite as extreme as Hardcore. The Contra 3 restoration not only gives you back the unlimited continues of the Japanese version, but also the cheat codes, one of which allows for 30 lives. When returning to older generations, you'll often hear people say that a game hasn't aged well, without taking into account the time period it was made in, and the limitations that came with it. While I generally don't have a problem adjusting to some of the more antiquated features of older games, there's definitely times when I found myself wishing for certain minor quality of life improvements or optimizations. Alex Kidd in Miracle World mapped the jump and attack buttons opposite to what we're accustomed to. The reverse controls hack does nothing more than assign the buttons as they should be, making it feel more natural. The action platforming of the early Castlevania games certainly taught some valuable lessons to those who grew up with them. The first and foremost of which was committing to your jump, because there was no turning back. Well, that is, until now. The improved controls hack for Castlevania 1 and 3 give you that freedom to angle or turn back mid-jump, and to have a tiny bit of control after taking a hit. This might betray some of the core challenges of these early games, but some might find it makes them infinitely more playable now. Earthbound has a rudimentary hack that assigns menial tasks to buttons so you don't have to click through several layers of your menu. Now, if you want to talk to someone, you just walk up to them and press A. One of my favorite quality of life hacks is the integration of a save system, so that you can resume your progress later on. I realize that something like this might seem silly for people who use emulators armed with save states, but for people like myself who prefer to play on real hardware whenever possible, I think it's pretty great. Call me weak or whatever, but I always thought that Super Mario 3 was way too long if you didn't use warp whistles. So a save feature is something that I welcome openly. The battery hack will save your game after each level, letting you resume whenever you feel like. There's no real interface for the game saves, it just works in the background. If you want to start from the beginning, just select Erase at the title screen. The Master System has a number of great games that benefit from the addition of a save hack. Spellcaster, an action game with some graphical adventure segments, is fairly lengthy and has a 24-character password that was especially tough to remember when you had to write it down. A save hack lets you load from the last time you called down a password from the heavens. Compile's Govelius has a password-style system consisting of 32 characters you have to input. This save hack automatically generates a save every time you visit Winkle, who is placed around the map in various caves. Finally, for the Wonder Boy 3 fans out there, the Master System version has a SRAM hack that allows you to continue from the last time you stopped in to see the Eye Patch Pig. Although influential, the original Metroid doesn't exactly sit high on my replay list. Sure, it's pretty cool to see the beginnings of the series, but the quality of life additions of the sequels make it kinda hard to go back to the original. If only we could take the luxuries of Metroid 2 and Super Metroid and retrofit them for the first game. The Metroid Plus saving hack gives you the ability to save your game instead of writing down a massive password each time you're ready to call it a day. At the bare minimum, this sounds enticing, but the way these save files are presented feels incredibly natural and authentic. Whenever you die, you'll be given the option to save your game, which is nice, but remember that you'll always be revived with just 30 health and completely drained energy tanks, same as the original. However, you can preserve your current energy by saving manually. To do so, just pause your game and press up and A on the second controller. I just wish there was a slightly different implementation, because this isn't exactly convenient. An equally, if not more important addition to this hack is the mini-map that appears when you press start. I've always felt that the original Metroid is much harder to find your way through because of how rooms tend to repeat and how vertical shafts go on forever. This does a lot to alleviate getting lost and setting a destination, but don't expect a Super Metroid level of integration. You're given the entire map of Planet Zebes right off the bat. And it's pretty small on the screen, meaning you'll have to do a lot of scrolling if you want to plan out a specific route to explore. To top it off, it's not filled in or colored differently to show where you've been already, which might limit its overall usefulness. That's not to say that all these hacks have to have some grand mission statement. Sometimes it's tiny additions and tweaks that make for a more interesting experience, which might be a good way to replay some old favorites.
Rise from your grave.
For instance, myself and a handful of Altered Beast fans out there might think it's fun to play the Genesis version with the arcade voices hacked in.
Power up.
Maybe you just wanted Lightning Force to be called by its real name, Thunder Force 4. Chris Covell's work-in-progress conversion to the TurboGrafx 16 version of R-Type to the more powerful Super Graphics hardware is pretty cool to see. It gets rid of the slowdown, sprite flicker, and increases the vertical resolution. Although it currently only works up until level 4, I'm excited to see this get completed one day. Let's face it, no discussion about ROM hacking would be complete without fan translations. When the community surrounding a game comes together, great things happen, and many of these localizations are proof of that. Although it received a full English release, the Mega Man 7 restoration has a completely new fan translation, while also reincorporating minor cut content from the US version, such as post-boss conversations with Otto or Roll. Although the translation isn't exactly wonderful, with several grammar mistakes, Mega Man fans will undoubtedly see a lot of value here. To a much greater extent, Dynamite Headdy had its story elements almost completely gutted and a bunch of specific graphical and difficulty elements adjusted. A delocalization corrects this, and has all the story elements fully translated into English. In the Japanese version, you also start with 2 continues, a welcome reprieve in this deceptively difficult game. Assault Suit Vulcan, or as we know it in the USA, Cybernator, has a complete fan translation which restores all kinds of stuff, such as character portraits and missing story elements. Do-Re-Mi Fantasy was one of the great SNES platformers that never released in the West. When it was released on the Wii Virtual Console, it was kind of a big deal. But as was typical of most imports on the VC, it was left completely untranslated, which might make the game's progression confusing for newcomers who may not know that they need to collect certain items in every level. A fan translation for a game like this is almost a given, considering the minimal amount of text here. And then, there's the RPGs. The RPG fan community has worked tirelessly since the early days of ROM hacking. Chances are, if a game is pretty decent, there's going to be a fan translation for it. Although it's probably obvious, the Super Nintendo has the greatest wealth of fan-translated projects, mainly due to the output of quality titles by Enix and Squaresoft in particular. My first experiences with Final Fantasy V and Seiken Densetsu 3 came from these sorts of projects. And while these both finally have official translations, there's an absolute ton of great games that still have never been localized. Chief among these are Bahamut Lagoon and Treasure of the Rudras. Both are late-gen Super Famicom releases that we somehow missed out on, with Square choosing to localize Capcom's Breath of Fire instead. Speaking of which, the Breath of Fire 2 retranslation project is a must for anyone who suffered through one of the worst official translations that I can think of. In fact, this is much more than just a retranslation. It adds all kinds of new AV elements, like a new opening and text box. Although, I do wish you could turn off that status screen background though. Ys fans should check out Eon Genesis' translation of Ys 5, Kefin, Lost Kingdom of Sand. This Super Famicom exclusive entry is the only year of Adol's Journeys that still have no Western release of any kind, which sorta makes it a must-play, despite not being all that well regarded in the series as a whole. On the PC Engine Super CD-ROM, Ys 4, Dawn of Ys received an absolutely incredible fan translation that went as far as getting voice actors to dub the cutscenes.
Dogi! Dogi, is that you? And that's Adol!
Hey, boss!
Although Ys, Memories of Celceta may have rendered the story in this release obsolete, the effort here should not be ignored. It's still well worth checking out for fans who enjoy the bump-style gameplay of Ys 1 and 2. Even the Sega Saturn has been getting in on the fan translation action lately. Although we were lucky to get Shining Force 3 as the Saturn was on its deathbed here in the US, the sad fact is that it's a woefully incomplete story. In Japan, there were 2 scenarios that followed up on and fleshed out the story and world. Both of these have since then been fully translated to English. The newest Saturn fan translation release is Linkle Liver Story, an action RPG that was Nextech's follow-up to their 16-bit Zelda-like Crusader of Senti. Unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be nearly as many fan translations for CD-based games in general. On PlayStation 1, the best effort that I've come across is Fantasian Productions' translation of the Tales of Phantasia remake. This is generally considered to be the definitive version of the game, with added content, animated cutscenes, and more. There's a decent number of Japanese games that were fully localized to English and released in PAL territories, but not in North America. Thankfully, many of these official translations have been patched for 60Hz playback on NTSC consoles. Of these, the one that I'd say that you've gotta play is Terranigma, which along with Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, make up Quintet's legendary Gaia trilogy. What a travesty it was that this game was never brought to North America, but at least it was fully translated to English for a PAL release. This is, without a doubt, one of the top 5 Super NES games that we missed out on. The other big one is Treasure's Boss Rush Run and Gun Alien Soldier, which was long considered one of the most impressive games on the Mega Drive, with huge sprites and tons of action on screen. In the US, Alien Soldier was only released on the Sega Channel service originally, but it has made appearances in various collections since. But if you want to play on original hardware, you can instead play a 60Hz patched version of the PAL release. Sometimes, something a bit more extreme is warranted. Some hacks go all the way, combining different facets of restorations, delocalizations, and quality of life hacks to give a game a more thorough makeover. Now, I'm an unabashed fan of Working Designs, the game publisher responsible for localizing a number of relatively obscure Japanese titles for systems like the TurboGrafx-16, Sega CD, and Sega Saturn. But for all the interesting things that they did before shutting down in 2005, their translations and their tweaking of various aspects of games that they published is, well, pretty divisive to put it lightly.
Muttonhead? He's the one who broke the Black Seal, P-Brain.
From 90s pop culture humor to upping the difficulty in extreme ways, there's a large contingent of people out there that absolutely loathe what they did to certain games. Enter the Unworked Designs. These hacks were created by ROMHacking.net forum user Supper and undoes most of the changes by Working Designs and reverts them back to their Japanese counterparts, except for their signature translations. These restoration hacks are available for a range of releases, from the TurboGrafx-16 CD to the PlayStation 1. Each game-specific download includes the necessary pieces to patch a disk image either automatically or manually. However, I'm going to be honest here. It took a lot of trial and error to get most of these to work right. Depending on how your disk image is ripped, things might not go so smoothly. Some games were more heavily altered by Working Designs than you may have realized. The most heavily affected were both Lunar the Silver Star and its sequel, Lunar Eternal Blue. While the first game increased the stats of some bosses, the second game buffs all enemies across the board significantly and makes the game pretty challenging. Returning these factors to normal make things a lot more fun, but not too easy. But the biggest change is one that I think that everyone who has ever played the Sega CD version of Lunar 2 can agree on being awful, and that's the use of having to spend magic points to save your game. Why this decision was made is beyond me, and combined with the increased difficulty, makes the game exceptionally grueling in the early parts. The Unworked Design patch reverts these tweaks, but not all changes to these games were underneath the hood. You probably noticed the use of uppercase and lowercase letters in the patched version, which is much more aesthetically pleasing than the all-caps screaming of the originals. In addition, some previously censored content has been restored, but I must say that there is one particular disappointment for me with this version of Lunar 2, and that's the removal of the Star Dragon Tower music, which in my opinion remains one of the best final dungeon themes of all time. But I'll gladly take the loss of that track as a trade-off for the save and difficulty restoration. Working Design's other Sega CD games, Vi and Potful Mail, don't have quite as elaborate unworkings, but are nonetheless worth checking out. Both games have restored enemy and character stats, in addition to bringing item costs back in line with their Japanese counterparts. Potful Mail in particular becomes much easier as a result, which might not be to everyone's liking, but I think it's a bit more fun and breezy this way. Cosmic Fantasy II, Exile, and Exile Wicked Phenomenon on the TurboGrafx-16 CD had some censored content restored and enemy health brought back to match their Japanese versions. However, this is where I ran into the biggest snag. I couldn't apply these patches to my disk images no matter what I tried. Hey, at least it doesn't seem like we missed out on too much with these. Even some of their 32-bit releases were given the Unworked Designs treatment. Magic Knight Rayearth on the Saturn has enemy stats and speed restored. Both Lunar Complete games also have many changes compared to their Japanese releases, but much less work was needed to restore them compared to these Sega CD games. Most of it comes down to stats and money tweaks. As of the time of this video, there's been very little progress on the project in the past 2 years, so it's hard to say whether or not these will ever be completely finished. Perhaps someone can pick up and carry the torch, because I'm sure there's a decent number of people out there who would like to see the PS1 version of Silhouette Mirage get unworked. When the Game Boy Color released in 1998, one of the most exciting early releases was The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX, an enhanced version of the black and white Game Boy Classic, now featuring excellent use of color. While Nintendo would go on to colorize a handful of other Game Boy games with GBC-specific features, it never really became a major trend. This is one area where the ROM hacking community has been able to step in and give us what Nintendo never did. A popular, more recent Game Boy Color update is the Super Mario Land DX patch by Torres. This is much more than a basic colorization, with many of the sprites and backgrounds having been updated to mesh better with a fully colored world. Extra flourishes, like gradients, use the Game Boy Color hardware in a way that makes Super Mario Land look almost a step beyond what you'd expect from an 8-bit game. However, the most notable drawback is that this very ambitious coat of new paint does seem to strain the hardware a bit, and scrolling is oftentimes not as smooth as the original version. Some might not even notice this choppiness, but it's also present in Torres' popular Super Mario Land 2 DX patch, which was actually released first. Super Ghouls and Ghosts on the SNES was a flawed but decent follow-up to Ghouls and Ghosts. The biggest problem by far was the extreme slowdown, which cropped up at even the slightest bit of stress on the system. For many people, this did irreparable damage to the series' name and reputation. It was discovered years later that it actually stemmed from a programming error buried deep within the code. Decades after its release, the Super Ghouls and Ghosts restoration hack patches this bit of errant code that causes the slowdown, while also bringing back the censored demonic names and religious imagery. The difference can be felt from early in the first stage, making this pretty much the ultimate version, and may do a lot to repair your views on the game. I still think that Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis is way better though. Anyway, does this mean that the slowdown in a lot of the early Super NES games were due to a programming error? No. Let's not kid ourselves. Slowdown in the system was a very real problem. But one Brazilian ROM hacker is going to great extents to fix this in some of the early Super NES games. One of the more interesting projects that has got a lot of attention this past year is Vitor Vilela's Gradius 3 SA1 hack, which applies Nintendo's enhancement chip that was used in games like Kirby Superstar and Super Mario RPG to offload the heavy lifting from the SNES's CPU. The results are incredibly impressive. Even the slightest hint of slowdown is gone, most obviously when the screen fills up with bubbles on level 2. Since the slowdown gives you more reaction time, chances are that this version of the game is going to be significantly more difficult for most players. Die-hard fans, though, they're going to eat this up and have probably already been playing it since its release. A much less talked about SA1 conversion that Vitor has been working on is for Super Mario World. You're probably thinking, what? Why? And yeah, improvements aren't nearly as apparent here, but when you really start looking for slowdown in Mario World, you might be surprised how often you find it. I've never noticed it, and now that it's been pointed out, I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to unsee it. I never knew that something as simple as the circle out at the end of a level was causing the game to slow down. Whether you think it's worthwhile or pointless, the work that Vitor Vilela is doing is paving the way for even more SA1 hacks, and I can't wait to see what's next. The world of video game hacks is super expansive. There's so many of them out there, and although it seems like the stupid or bad hacks get all the spotlight these days, there's still a ton of people out there working on more subtle hacks like the ones I've shown you here that improve upon or fix certain aspects of our favorite games. I mean, how cool is it that these features are even possible, and that they're playable on real hardware to boot? To the people working on these, I want you to know that those of us playing and enjoying these hacks truly appreciate the work that you're doing, and that it's not going unnoticed.